Yo, what is going on, Company Gang? It's your boy, Company. So for today's video, I'm going to be talking about what, in my opinion, are the top risk factors for becoming a NEET. And before we get started, I just have to kind of say that there are probably way more risk factors that I haven't thought about or that I deliberately didn't include in this list because, firstly, there are way too many, and secondly, I feel that many of the things that I'm going to mention in this video encompass a lot of the risk factors that I've omitted. So you could sort of see them as being categories that, include all of these different risk factors that I don't mention. So anyways, let's start the video. So the first risk factor is a pretty obvious one, and that would be being born after the 90s. And you might be wondering why I chose this time period specifically. And the reason for that is that generally people born after the 90s have been born in an age where they are exposed to the internet in their developmental years. And the reason I place so much importance in this is because the internet is probably one of the key risk factors in itself that causes a person to become a NEET. So really I should just be saying the internet, but obviously people in boomers, for example, weren't exposed to the internet when they were growing up. But anyone born after the 90s and maybe like the late 80s definitely was. And during your formative years, like your teenage years or even your childhood years, your brain is undergoing a lot of change and adaptation. And when it's exposed to something as profoundly, influential as the internet, because, well, firstly, it's basically, this non-stop stream of information that is, I guess, more and more so being designed to be highly addictive. And when you're exposed to this in your formative years, you basically become hopelessly addicted to it, be it social media, YouTube, the millions of different video games and TV shows and series and things out there. And another reason why it's such a big factor is not just because of its influence on the formation of your brain when you're growing up, but it's also that I feel like the internet is probably both the number one cope and the number one thing that entraps people in a state of NEETdom, because it's basically allows you the ability to endlessly consume media and endlessly give your brain these dopamine hits, which your brain is constantly chasing. And it also is highly addictive and makes it so that you're essentially desensitized to a lot of different things that you otherwise normally, wouldn't be desensitized to, that you would normally find enjoyable, productive things, but you don't find them enjoyable because your brain is essentially fried from consuming way too much media and just consuming, or partaking in the internet in general. So that's my first risk factor, which is being born after the 90s. I guess obviously, everyone alive now has access to the internet, but you're probably more likely to get addicted to it if you were exposed to it in your formative years. That's why I mentioned being born after the 90s. So the second risk factor would probably have to be mental illness and disability. And I'm lumping these two things together because I feel like they fundamentally cause NEETdom in the exact same ways, which is they impair a person's ability to function in society, to function in the world, and to interact in the world normally. It's just that the difference is that one is physical in terms of like disabilities, and one is mental in terms of mental illness. And so in terms of like what disabilities in particular, we're talking about things like having all of your limbs chopped off, even just like losing your hands, which is the most important part of your body, arguably, or blindness, or being paralyzed, that probably will force you to become NEET. And when it comes to things like mental illness, well, that's where it gets more interesting, because I'm referring to things like autism, social anxiety. So these are any mental illness that causes you to have extreme social deficits, or any mental illness that basically impairs your ability to deal with the outside world. So things like paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia, maybe dissociative identity disorder, depending on what the personalities are like and how severe it is. But just things of that nature, which just make it extremely hard for you to function. Therefore, I'm listing mental illness and disability as my second risk factor. The third risk factor would probably have to be adverse childhood experiences, which is just having a bad childhood. And obviously there's so many types of bad childhoods that can happen to you, just like mental illnesses, where there's so many different mental illnesses which impact you in different ways. But fundamentally, they all lead to fairly similar outcomes, which is, well, a bad adulthood. And so let's take bad parenting, for example. So let's say your parents can either be way too strict and way too abusive, or they can be way too lenient and way too, they coddle you basically. And both of these types of parents can have extremely different impacts on the child, but at the end of the day, that child somehow finds a way to become NEET, because, well, they're basically they're basically predisposed to having various mental illnesses, and just behaving in various ways, having weak personalities and all, for different reasons. For example, low self-esteem, or things like that. Low self-esteem, they're more likely to be bullied. Their lack of character, lack of work ethic, things like that. Despair, nihilism, all that. And also bullying is another example of this, where it's not the same as parenting, but obviously I feel like people who are bullied in their childhood and teenage years are more likely to become NEET, because, well, the risk of becoming socially anxious, or just social phobic, having agoraphobia, things like that. Yeah, it's just a consequence of bullying and trauma. All of these different traumatic experiences that happen in your formative years definitely play a role in people becoming NEET, because of how they cause you to not function properly, to be broken basically. So the third risk factor would probably have to be economic conditions. And when I say economic conditions, it's like what I mentioned previously, where two things on the opposite end of the spectrum can lead to similar outcomes, just with different causes. So obviously, when I say economic conditions, I'm mostly referring to poverty, because, well, with poverty, you're less likely to be exposed to, certain ideas. You're less likely to have better education. You're less likely to, to have lots of things, and you're more likely to experience a lot of stress, a lot of the aforementioned things that in terms of like adverse childhood experiences. You're more likely to be bullied. You're more likely to, just have a hard time. And also, you're probably less likely to, not all the time, because obviously some people, end up making it out of poverty, and it can be like a thing that drives them to work hard. But on the other hand, you have people who just buckle under the pressure, like, and I guess it's all down to genetics, your genetic predisposition to stress and whatever adversity. And on the other hand, you have being born in like first world countries where I guess you're surrounded by all these modern amenities and luxuries like the internet, obviously, and cheap food, and you likely have parents who own their own home, and a comfy home at that, so it's probably nice to stay in that home. And so that's kind of like on the opposite end of the spectrum, where you're basically in a way lucky enough to live in conditions where you're allowed to be neat. That would be probably referring to someone like me, but pretty much anyone who lives in first world countries, well, I guess, and again, being born in modern times, you're most likely to become neat that way. Let me just quickly check on the other risk factors that I wrote, because I'm kind of forgetting. So it actually turns out that I'm down to the last thing on my list. So because I was supposed to talk about bad childhood experiences and bullying separately, but now that I think about it, they should be in one category. So anyways, the last thing on the list would probably have to be genetics. And this is going to be a pretty controversial one, because no one likes to think that, well, they were born to be a NEET, they were born to be a failure, they were born to be completely and utterly useless. But the fact of the matter is that, well, it's not the fact of the matter, it's just my opinion, but I feel like, if, for example, you are born, let's say you're scrawny, you're weak, you're short, or you're naturally predisposed to be overweight, or you have like an ugly face. All these things, for example, end up causing you to be treated poorly by other people, and makes you more likely to be bullied, makes you less likely to be treated well by your parents, by your relatives, and it leads to all the outcomes which I mentioned below. Also, things like a predisposition to addiction, having an addictive personality. That obviously would make you predisposed to being addicted to the internet, and predisposed to being addicted to a lot of other things. And obviously addiction is a mental illness in itself, and a pretty catastrophic one at that, if it's left unchecked. Then you have things like, how smart you are. Obviously, if you are not the smartest person, then you are less likely to do well in school, less likely to have access to high-paying jobs that would incentivize you to actually be in the workforce. Because let's face it, who really wants to work the traditional minimum wage job nowadays? It just seems hellish and boring. And on the other hand, you actually have people who are too smart. And when I say too smart, I mean they're smart enough where they're capable of rationalizing a lot of different BS. Like for example, a smart person, I forget, there's like a high correlation between intelligence and mental illness, but I think it makes sense because generally speaking, smart people are more likely to, let's say, they're more effective at finding evidence for things. So even if it's things like their own negative beliefs about themselves, they'll be able to find numerous examples and hold those examples in memory, and I guess in a way process them and ingrain these thoughts more deeply in their, integrate them into their personality better. Whereas someone who's not as smart might actually forget about negative experiences, or how they're bullied. They might more easily, you know, let go of their negative beliefs about themselves. So that's kind of, in a funny way, a bigger risk factor as well. And also there's, I don't know how true this is, but you know, there's also the saying that, you know, smart people tend to be lazy as well. I'm not sure how true this is. Could be just major cope by dumb people who want to think that they're smart. So I have no idea. But yeah, that's, I guess, another aspect of genetics. And also just the fact that it's interesting how a lot of NEETs that I've seen on YouTube, on, you know, including myself, we all seem to have this very similar body type of, well, obviously there's the overweight ones, and then there's two types of NEETs basically in terms of body type. There's the overweight ones, and then you have the ones that basically look like ET, where they have like the pretty large head with a naturally high hairline and you know, skinny fat fat distribution, where they are extremely scrawny but somehow manage to have a lot of belly fat at the same time, and they basically look like ET, or you know how the Greys look like, you know, like those aliens with the big heads and the weirdly shaped bodies. That's pretty much what a lot of NEETs look like as well. Obviously not to that extreme, but I think it is a pretty common body type. My body type used to look like that a lot more before I started working out, but if you saw how I looked before, you could immediately tell that I was more predisposed to being a NEET. So that's in my opinion why genetics are also another risk factor, because I feel like all these things are pretty much genetically determined, you know, for the most part, in combination with some environmental influence. But yeah, anyways, that's gonna end this video. So anyways, make sure to like and hit the subscribe button down below if you enjoyed this video. And this is Company NEET signing out.